Hi, I'm Tara, and welcome to Les Do Books. Email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with any questions or comments, or come join the Facebook group, The Lesbian Review Book Club. I'm really excited because Roslyn Sinclair is back. Her book, The Lily and the Crown, is out everywhere from Ilva Publishing. You should totally read it because it's fabulous and has lesbian space pirates. I don't know what else you could possibly want. So welcome, Roslyn.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Tara, and thanks for the kind words.
So you are actually here to talk about The Devil Wears Prada with me.
Absolutely.
So pretty much whenever I want to take a break from reading for review, I read fanfic. And almost every single time, it's a Devil Wears Prada story. That is I don't want to call it a guilty pleasure because I don't feel guilty. I love it. That's kind of where I go. But when I was coming up with the idea for this podcast about getting into Devil Wears Prada fan fiction with recommendations and whatever, I thought who better than the author of the greatest and most popular Devil Wears Prada fan fiction in all time, but you, Telanu.
Oh my, I'm blushing.
Well, so you wrote Truth and Measure, which everybody fangirls about. And I thought, what about for people who want to go beyond Truth and Measure and they don't know where to go because it's a very big and active sandbox?
Isn't that wonderful? Isn't it great that it's still so big after all this time?
It is amazing. So I thought just to start off, for the three people who maybe don't know what we're talking about, and if you don't, why don't you? Can you just share a little bit about what actually is The Devil Wears Prada?
Oh boy, oh boy. Okay, so The Devil Wears Prada started as a novel, which I actually have not been able to finish because I don't enjoy it particularly. That was basically sort of this thinly veiled autobiographical experience of an assistant who worked for Anna Wintour, the editor-in-chief of Vogue. And it was a big bestseller, and they made it into a movie that's very different in many ways from the book and far more appealing. And so the Anna Wintour character is named Miranda Priestley, and she's played by the fabulous Meryl Streep, who's wearing the best white wig I've ever seen. And, just wonderful haughtiness, sort of ice-cold reserve. And then the assistant character is named Andy Sachs, Andrea, Andy for short, played by Anne Hathaway. And the story is mainly Andy's journey as being Miranda's assistant. She starts off as this journalist who wants to do serious work and kind of can't believe that she's working at a fashion magazine, which is called Runway. And over time, and of course, Miranda's a horrible boss, demanding, never, lots of unreasonable demands and stuff like that. Just terrible to work for, very dismissive, but also really good at her job, very brilliant and driven and talented. And so Andy comes to see those two sides of her. And it's kind of about her basically growing up, coming to value things that she dismissed before, but also in some ways sort of the movie implies that she's losing her integrity in a way that I don't totally agree with, honestly. I could argue with that forever, but I won't.
Mm-hmm.
So the story, it's, one of those kind of coming-of-age stories for a young woman. And I won't ruin the ending for anybody, but the ending is about Andy deciding who she really wants to be. Does she want to be more like Miranda or not, basically?
So why did you start writing the fanfic?
Well, I saw the movie for the first time on cable TV, actually. I was visiting my sister, and I just turned on the TV at her house, and it started midway through the movie. I think it was maybe at the Met Gala scene. Mm-hmm. And I was instantly hooked because Meryl Streep, of course, looked fabulous. Anne Hathaway looked gorgeous. She was whispering, Andy's whispering in Miranda's ear and stuff, and I was like, oh no. Here I go. And I watched the whole thing, and I was just so seized by it, just by how appealing I found it. For one thing, I'll talk in a minute about why I think it's still so popular, so I'll skip this part. But it was just, the chemistry was so electric. It was just so enjoyable to watch. And on the way home from my sister's, it was a several hours long drive. I was basically writing in my head the first story I ever wrote for that fandom, which was called She Likes a Prize Fight. I got back, and the first thing I did, I think, was buy the DVD, back in ye olden times. And I watched the whole movie through and through, and I sat down and wrote the story, and it was one of those stories that I felt like I was just pulling out of the air, like it had been waiting to be found. And from then on out, I was hooked, and I wrote Devil Wears Prada stories for 2 years solid, and I don't think I've ever written as much in any other fandom, and I don't think any other fandom has ever challenged my imagination so much as that one.
So what drove Truth and Measure? Because it is this, like, it's a novel.
It is, and that's funny, because it was always intended to be this short, silly story. Honest to God, I had this funny idea. I was originally going to title it even Fetching, because if you've seen the movie, you know there's this line that's very famous among fangirls where Miranda tells Andy that she's very fetching. And yeah, that's heterosexual, right? So I was originally going to title it Fetching, both for Andy being fetching, you know, in a cute way, and also for her fetching and carrying for a pregnant Miranda. Because I thought, gosh, you know, what's the kind of, I like to challenge characters, and you think, you know, you'll hear writing advice often like take what the characters care most about and take it away from them, or put them in, you know, the one situation they're not prepared for or whatever. And I thought, God, wouldn't it be interesting to see what would happen with a pregnant Miranda? Ha ha ha, I'll just make it a funny short story. Like, you know, there's this term for people who aren't into fandom, there's this term called crack fic, which is a type of story that's just designed to be crazy, off the wall, not to be taken seriously. And I was so sure that a story about Miranda Priestley getting pregnant would have to be like that. And instead, I found myself exploring the theme very seriously. And I think I knew the moment where I knew I was hooked on the premise, and I had to explore it all the way to the end and see if I could examine it, you know, in its real complexity, was the moment when there's a scene where Miranda suspects that she's pregnant and sends Andy to get a pregnancy test from a pharmacy. And the scene where Miranda realizes that she is pregnant, that was the moment when I thought, okay, this is actually a real story that I want to write.
Mm-hmm. And it's one of those, like, I know the first time I read it, and also the second and the third, if I'm being honest, it was like I couldn't put it down. It just consumed me. And it was one of those stories that, like, it just kind of digs right into your bones, and you're there all the way until the end. And so when I've given it to other people to read, the same thing happens to them. So I love that you did that.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing that.
So the movie's been out for like 12 years or something like that. Like, why do you think it endures? Because even now, like, it really is a thriving fandom. There's stories going up every day. There are chapters going up. There's, like, communities that are gathering together and are kind of feeding off each other with it. So, like, what do you think it is about this movie?
Well, there's one answer that's actually a little bit, I think, kind of depressing about it. Remind me to get it into a second. But I want to start off with this anecdote of something that just happened last week in my office, actually. With a woman who's not in fandom. But for anybody who's ever seen the movie, you might recognize this line. I was sitting in my office, and outside the office door where things were just crazy, it was a really busy day at week, I heard our office manager say, "I love my job. I love my job. I love my job." And this is a woman who I think is in her 50s. And I called out and I was like, "Have you ever seen The Devil Wears Prada?" And there was this moment of silence. And then she said, "Oh my God, that is my favorite movie." Mm-hmm. And I, you know, went running out there, and we just, you know, sort of exclaimed and squealed about how great the movie is and all the stuff that we liked about it. Of course, I left all of the gay fan fiction out of the picture. I didn't touch on that. But it was just the fact that this is such a movie. And the kind of depressing thing about it is that this is still rare, to the point where you find it and it sticks with you forever, because there really aren't other movies like that about two women of two different generations who have this complex relationship. They meet, you know, like, you've heard of the Bechdel test, of course. I think probably all of your listeners have heard of it. But just as a recap, in case anybody hasn't, the Bechdel test is the lowest bar possible for female interaction in a movie, which is where two female characters with names, I think, talk to each other about something other than a man. And The Devil Wears Prada doesn't just sort of hop over that very low bar, but it goes higher and higher and higher, to the point where I can't remember. I think Miranda and Andy have one conversation about men, and that's about Miranda's husband and how he's not showing up to Fashion Week. But other than that, really everything they talk about is about jobs, about the drive to succeed, about getting ahead, about how Andy's, you know, failing in her job, and later about how she's doing well in her job. And just Andy sort of at the end openly challenging Miranda for some of the things that she says. It's about two characters learning from and growing from each other. And I've heard, I think it was my beta reader, Luthien, who called the men in the story handbags. You know, accessories who were mainly there to show the growth of the female characters. And just the fact that even now, 12 years later, we don't have a lot of movies like that, a lot of stories like that. So, of course, women are still connecting to it.
It's true. And I think even if it's not your favorite movie, because, it's not going to necessarily be for everyone. Although, again, I don't know why. You might still love the fanfic if you typically love romances that feature age gaps or workplace romances or ice queens. Because bringing them all three together, for me, that's kind of the perfect trifecta. And I think part of why, I really enjoyed the movie, but I also love that you get to see those three themes done really, really well in different interpretations by different authors.
Exactly. Absolutely. And it's one of those fandoms where there's really kind of one main pairing. There are some other stories that focus on other pairings, you might get, especially I think Emily and Serena.
Yeah.
There's some stories about that, but it's so incredibly interesting that there isn't a fandom for, stories about Andy and her boyfriend Nate. I honestly don't where they're earnestly shipped.
Well, he's the worst, though.
Yeah, he is. And so it's just you go into Harry Potter fandom or something like that, and you'll find a jillion different pairings. Same with Star Wars, Star Trek, all that. You come to The Devil Wears Prada, and you're going to find Miranda and Andy. And
that's true.
I really enjoy that, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. So, as promised, you have some recommendations for people who do want to get started. And just so that people know, I will link to all of these in the show notes. So what is your first recommendation?
Okay, well, I will say I've got 5. And my first 2 are a little bit selfish because I didn't write them, but I did beta read both of them. And for anybody who doesn't know what a beta read is, it's similar, I guess, to the fan fiction equivalent of an editor, I guess. You show your story to someone else before you post it publicly, and that person gives you feedback on it and helps you iron out any problem areas. So the first one is called When in Doubt, Wear Red, which is a quote, I think, from the designer Bill Blass, and it's by an author who's got the wonderful pseudonym of The Last Good Name. And it's set after the movie, but it's what we call an AU, an alternative universe, where Andy doesn't quit. Oh, this is going to spoil the ending. I'm sorry, I don't know how not to do that.
They've had 12 years.
Yeah, exactly. A post-film story in which Andy doesn't leave Runway, in which she stays and keeps working for Miranda. And it becomes this sort of wonderful slow burn story where you see immediately the scene where Andy follows Miranda into the meeting instead of leaving her. Miranda tells her, "Don't you leave my side for a single second." And after that, the intensity just sort of builds and grows. And there's all kinds of wonderful things. There's this smoking hot scene when they get into a heavy petting session in Miranda's office. Later one where they get into it, in a restroom. And eventually it becomes sort of a story about wanting more and wanting to be more serious and learning to trust. Yeah, and I really, really enjoyed that one because slow burns, oh my gosh, they're catnip for me.
I actually don't think I've read this one. This is turning out, I was thinking this would be great for everybody else, but this is turning out to be great for me because it's going to add to my reading list.
Yeah, oh yeah, I hope so. I really hope so. There's some good stuff I've got for you. The next one that I also beta read was for a Yuletide story, which is, I don't think Devil Wears Prada qualifies for Yuletide anymore, but it's a once-a-year sort of fan fiction fest that takes place during the winter holidays, in which people write stories from rare fandoms that don't usually have fanfic written for them. So you can say, I'm participating and I'd love a story that's set in, little tiny small fandom of your choice. And at the time, years ago, Devil Wears Prada was one of those. And my usual beta reader, her name is Luthien, I've mentioned her before, got assigned a story, this was funny, to be written for The Last Good Name. I mean, it was just this series of coincidences that was really delightful. And she wrote a story from Emily's point of view. And another thing I love is stories about outsider point of view as they look at the main pairing. And it's called Her Rightful Place. And it's set after the movie, in a scene where Andy does walk away, within the movie, after the movie itself. It's about Emily sort of realizing dimly after a while what's going on, in which Andy and Miranda are having kind of a secret affair and how intense their feelings for each other are. And the scene where she realizes it is just great. The characterization is perfect. Emily's voice is perfect. And because Emily's so delightful, like one of the things that's great about Emily is how seriously she takes herself, which of course makes her tremendously funny to watch and read about. And so there's wonderful humorous touches throughout the story and just sort of wonderful details, like Luthien gave Emily a cat named Westwood, named after the designer Vivienne Westwood.
That's so good.
Yeah, and she gave her an activist sister who never appears in the story, but who's obviously the polar opposite of Emily, and Emily mentions her a couple of times with just the greatest contempt. And it's a great story. So it's her rightful place. High recommendations. And I beta read that one too, and it was lots of fun. The next three I did not beta. I had no, complicity with them or anything. The third one is something called We Arrive in the Dark, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the author's name. Jibrailis, something like that. I apologize to the writer. And it's also set post-film in a sort of time when Miranda and Andy are also having a secret affair. We don't really learn about how that happened. It's not really the focus of the story. It's not really important. But it's a universe in which Andy and Miranda are having this affair while Andy is still friends with Nigel, and she's built up, who's sort of Miranda's right-hand man, and she's built up a close relationship with Miranda's twin daughters. And the focus of the story, because whenever you have a story that begins with a secret affair, the natural arc of the story is, okay, well, what's going to happen to make it more serious, to make it more public? That's kind of what we're waiting to see. And so the story centers around that year's Met Gala, which has a fairy tale theme. And there are just wonderful sort of nods to the theme throughout, including one of the character leaves a shoe behind for another character after the gala, or the ball is over. There's wonderful sensory details. There's a beautiful use of language. And I loved it so much that I pulled out a quote, which is, quote, Miranda peels Andrea out of her dress afterward, like an apple offered by a woman lost in the wood. She tosses the dress aside and eats.
So good.
I think that's just great. I mean, it's a beautiful story. The third one is by a wonderful writer named chainofclovers. And you should read everything by her. But one of her earliest stories, and one of the stories that really pulled me into her work and just kept me going after that, was titled A Good Message. And it's set after the movie, and again, in which Andy and Miranda are together, and they've come out, and their relationship is public. And they're moving in together sort of in the midst of all this skepticism and disapproval from their family and their friends. Everybody believes it's not going to last, and it's inappropriate and all that stuff. It's also set during the 2008 financial crisis, which is interesting because even Miranda Priestley needs to downsize. And so she and Andy are craving more stability in their relationship now that they're out. So they decide to find a new place and move in together. And the story does this really difficult thing, which is that it lets them be very tender and vulnerable with each other while still remaining in character, because that's a hard thing for Miranda Priestley to do, right? To be something like that. So, for example, after a difficult, conversation with her parents, Andy goes to Miranda to be soothed and comforted, and Miranda just says, "Oh, sweetheart." And I don't know a lot of writers who could believably make Miranda Priestley say, "Oh, sweetheart," but Chain of Clovers does it, and it's wonderful. One of the story's many great touches is just saying that Miranda's gay, which is language, especially at the beginning of the fandom, that we didn't often see. Chain of Clovers also is a lover of poetry, and that really shows up in her work. Her language is what I would just call reliably beautiful. And I've got another quote because I always have to show off. Not that Miranda gets sleepy particularly often. She's frequently tired of explaining why she shouldn't have to explain herself, tired of being at a boring party or meeting, tired in her bones or from a headache. Sleepy is different. It's not dull at all, but it's nearly edgeless, clumsy, warm. And it's just really sharp observations, not just about the two characters, but about what it's like to be human, that make you read it and go, yeah, I've been there. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think last week, read her Land Fathoms series. It was so good.
She's wonderful. I mean, just terrific. So yeah, Chain of Clovers, absolutely. Read her body of work. And the fifth one is very different from all of the rest of these. And it's called More Things in Heaven and Earth. And it's by a writer called Hayseed. And I mean, if you want to go back to fairy tales, like in the other story, this is about the darker side of fairy tales. It's tremendously enjoyable and disturbing. And it's set during the film, but something is seriously wrong. Miranda's behavior is I think it's set during the film, actually. It might be one of those alternative universes after the film. But either way, Andy's still Miranda's assistant. And Miranda's behavior is growing increasingly erratic. She begins disappearing for longer periods of time. Nobody knows where she is. And there's one night when she just doesn't return home and her children don't know where their mother is. And Andy, who is still, I think, the second assistant, like Emily's still the first assistant, and Andy feels more compelled to find her than a strict professional concern should suggest, because you can tell that the feelings are building, but she just can't acknowledge them and all that wonderful stuff. The next thing you know, she sort of finds herself facing, honest to God, supernatural dangers that she couldn't have imagined as she's, struggling to save Miranda Priestley from what is basically a terrible nightmare. And if I went into any other details, I feel like I would probably ruin the story. But if you like, fairy tales and suspense and supernatural stuff, it's just terrific fun.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's it for this episode. Thank you so much, Roslyn.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
So where can people find you online if they want to connect with you?
My Twitter handle is Writing Roslyn, and my Facebook page is Roslyn Writes.
So like I said, if anybody wants, they can go into the show notes to get the links for these stories. You can find me on Twitter if you need more. I'm sure you could also find Roslyn if you need more. Like, this is such a rich fandom. There's so many stories. And this is like just a taste to get you started.
Really, yes, absolutely.
So, I'm Tara. You've been listening to Les Do Books. Remember to email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with your questions or comments. If you're an author who's interested in joining me on the show to talk about the lesfic you love or the trends that have you interested, please let me know. If you've enjoyed this episode, please check out the show notes where you'll find a Patreon link for the Lesbian Talk Show. You're going to want to check that out because our patrons get exclusive content like bonus podcasts that nobody else gets access to, and they're pretty cool. And you can also join our Facebook group, the Lesbian Review Book Club, to talk about anything that you're reading and loving. To find this and many other great shows, all you need to do is search for the Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher.